globalization an important agenda in their democratic path, but more as they looked at other short-term political gimmicks as the best way to kind of gather some votes and so on and so forth. So even as economic liberalization might go to create longer and far stronger economic fundamentals, they have been resisted under India's democratic traditions for the same reason that I mentioned. Thus, the driving point is that democracy and economic well-being have a strange relationship in the case of India, and this has been something somewhat slightly contradictory to what we have seen in the institutional democracies in a sense in both South Korea and Taiwan in particular. Thus, I would argue that despite the political democratic traditions and practices, India's democratic traditions have largely confined in the political sphere rather than the economic sphere in a sense. The Indian economy, therefore, was very tightly controlled by the state, and the economic freedoms lacked, a problem that Indian governments are still attempting to correct the course in the last 2 decades, but one which is still very difficult to tackle in the domestic economic scenario. Thus, while many states in East Asia emphasize economic freedoms first, and despite a state role in their economic models too, and the political liberalization subsequently, India began with the political freedoms and a tightly controlled economy. So that's the major kind of distinction that I see between India and some of the Southeast Asian democracies, as well as the democracies in the typical liberal order that we see in the West in that sense. Second, even as India followed strong democratic traditions, the reality is that it never contemplated export of democracy, even in its own backyard, that has experienced several military coups and democratic disruptions. In fact, in the South Asian context, India had to be particularly careful, extra careful in introducing and promoting democracy unless the states themselves asked for such kind of assistance. And as several scholars write in this regard, India's biggest contribution to democracy promotion globally would be the success of its own democracy experiment in that sense. And in South Asia, one had to be careful, particularly in the context where you have Pakistan, now as Professor Stanton talked about in the morning. The issue has always been whether it is democracy that is more important or the stability of the country. You have had a civilian transition of power with Nawaz Sharif coming into power, but the fact is that is he able to control and bring stability and development in that particular country? So it's always been South Asia has presented itself as a huge challenge when it comes to democracy promotion, and India had to be extra careful in advocating as well as promoting democracy, particularly in its own backyard in a sense. So India's support at best has been in terms of far less controversial undertakings such as support for capacity building or training to run elections and so on and so forth. One another important consideration, like I said, is always been democracy versus stability in that sense. And I think, again, the long-standing support that India extended to Nepal's monarchy for a long time, again, in support of stability over civilian democracy is again a case in point to illustrate this point about how India had to balance between the stability versus democracy argument in a sense. It may also come across as a strange that while India's practice of democracy has been fairly strong with regular elections, space for individual freedoms, and an activist media, among other aspects, India did not shy away from pursuing closer relations with military leadership in Myanmar, for instance. Not only that, India was even resistant to the idea of imposing sanctions on some of the military regimes in that sense. This again proves the point that democracy was not the key factor in India's foreign policy. Rather, promotion of its national strategic interests has always dominated India's foreign policy approach. But again, I'm sure that this is not unique to India. Almost all the countries around the world would look at promotion of national core interests, strategic interests as the driving point rather than democracy or such other ideals abroad in a sense. So it's always been, there will always be a dilemma in finding the right balance, the fine balance between the pursuance of idealism and realism or strategic interest in a sense in any part of the world. So in a sense, rather than democracy, the key ideas that shaped India's foreign policy was anti-colonialism, protection of national sovereignty, and a moral imperative that was frequently anti-West in its broad orientation. And this was perhaps understandable to some extent considering India's own history of having been colonized and recognizing that much of the rest of Africa and Asia shared the same colonial history and experience. Given these priorities, promoting democracy would not have been a particularly an effective strategy, especially considering that most of the newly independent African Asian states descended into authoritarianism. There were two other equally compelling reasons why democracy promotion did not enjoy much support in India's strategic thinking. One was that democracy promotion, like I said in the beginning, was identified as part of the Western strategic rationale. And given the broad anti-West orientation in its moral imperative, this was not a smarter choice that India would have made, at least in the initial couple of decades. So that's one set of reasons, and it would have been extremely difficult for India to make that choice. A second reason was despite its supposed non-alignment posture, India was clearly much more sympathetic to the Soviet side of the Cold War argument. Considering Moscow's importance to India's strategy in countering both China and Pakistan, it would have been particularly uncomfortable for India to promote democracy. Thus, from both ideological and strategic reasons, India shied away from promoting or talking about democracy as an important idea in its foreign policy strategies. Now let me just come to some of the recent changes that we are seeing in India's foreign policy and democracy. How has it become a more of a strategic factor, at least since the early 2000s, for instance. Like I said, India did not follow through the promotion of democracy for a very long time in the first couple of decades. But obviously in the recent years there have been a change, at least in terms of its rhetoric. And the change again has not been so much in terms of actually spreading democracy in other countries, but rather a strategy for promoting closer ties with the US and the West in general on the basis of democratic values and traditions. In fact, Prime Minister Manmohan Singh, the former Prime Minister, went into the idea to elaborate this as to how he said, if there is an idea of India by which India should be defined, it is the idea of an inclusive, open, multicultural, multi-ethnic and multicultural society. India must show that democracy can deliver development and empower the marginalized. Liberal democracy is a natural political organization in today's world. All alternate systems, authoritarian and majoritarian in varying degrees, are only an aberration. So the kind of embrace and the kind of strong statements coming in support of liberal democracy and as a political answer to the on the problem is clearly a departure from the past when India has been very shy of embracing democratic ideals as an important way to kind of go about. And one of the push factors that India has started making this change in terms of embracing democracy promotion has been the recognition that of the US as an important partner in the new scheme of things for India. And so therefore, warming up of the ties with the US in the absence of the Soviet Union as a major pillar of strength for India, which was the case during the Cold War years, India was clearly in recognition of the new shifting power equations, balance of power in the global scale, and India was adjusting to that. So therefore, India decided to go along with the Community of Democracies established together with the US in 2000, as well as become an active founding member in the New Democracy Caucus and so on and so forth. But again, after the initial warming up to the whole idea, the idea of democracy as the key in the bilateral, as a democracy as the strategic glue is seen to be in a sense once again waning after the initial couple of years in the decade of 2000. So moving away again from active promotion of relationships based on democratic ideals, India is again once again to be seen more comfortable dealing with the less controversial objectives in the area of democracy promotion. One of the best examples is its engagement with Afghanistan, for instance. While again broader strategic interests drive India towards Afghanistan, there have been very few specific activities that are democracy promotion specific, how so passive they may be. And this is in terms of building the Afghan new parliament building out there, training assistance for the Afghan parliament members, other assistance in terms of conducting elections including supplying of the electronic voting machines and so on and so forth. India has also taken similar stand in Bhutan, for instance, as it makes a transition towards a more democratic order, again providing assistance in terms of constitutional support, experts, training assistance, and so on and so forth. So there have been also another aspect that I want to highlight is how India has been also using some of the multilateral platforms to enforce its idea of promotion of democracy, for instance. And this has been seen particularly India using the Commonwealth of Nations platform to kind of criticize military coups, for instance, in Fiji and Pakistan in the past, and how both of those two countries were suspended, their membership were suspended for a brief time. So in a sense, India does not want to put itself out there to a bilateral framework where India's own relationship would get strained, but use the multilateral forum, multilateral platforms to enforce the idea of democracy from a most importantly. A third factor as to why India is changing in some of this policy of embracing democratic ideas is also because India is gaining its influence beyond Asia, and its overall rising profile makes it that India also embrace some of the global ideals such as democracy in its foreign policy approaches, in a sense. So even as it is uncomfortable with the idea of Western idea of imposing democracy systems abroad, it is using the multilateral route to kind of impose its interests, but that provides it a certain amount of cover and cushion and stuff. Final point, democracy is obviously making a comeback in some of India's strategic relationships, increasingly driven by the balance of power interests. And the arc of democracy proposed by Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe in 2007 is one case in point. But similar articulations again coming from Shinzo Abe. He talked about the Diamond Initiative again, and a sort of concern of democracies coming together. I think this is an idea that's again gaining some sort of traction even within India, given that the rise of China is a huge factor for all of us too, and not only from a bilateral perspective, but also what kind of a regional security architecture are we looking at? India is clearly and is influential in that sense, but we don't want to see an Asia that is dominated by one single power. So in a sense, how India, US, Japan, Taiwan, all of these countries might come together in shaping this region's security architecture along the lines of democratic countries coming. So the idea of democracy as a strategic factor